Hi guys. Um oh, I need to get rid of these emails. Okay. So, a couple of things that I wanted to mention before I start in with the review. I am going to go over periods 4 and 5 of your study guide today. But yesterday, as you probably know, was like one of the first days of all of the AP tests, and AP Gov was yesterday, and I know some AP Gov teachers, and I'm part of a few like AP history teacher groups online. And so I was asking some people like what the exam was like, and some of the like security protocols, people are starting to find out what they were, and they're starting to come out. I still don't know about them like hacking into all the cameras in your home, or being like the NSA or anything. I still haven't heard anything about any of that, but one thing I have heard is that from teachers whose students have contacted them when they finish the exam to tell them what the question was, is that they're hearing different questions. And the questions are not different, like they're not really different, but they are like subtly different. So basically what I'm thinking is, as the exam, like, when you all log on to the exam, a lot of you will all have different forms. I'm not saying that all 17 of you will be taking a different exam, but there will definitely be multiple questions out there. And there will probably be some questions that are like really different, like on different periods. But then there will be other questions that are very similar, but maybe the wording of the question is different. Maybe the documents are the same and the question is different, or the question is the same and the documents are different, or the documents are in a different order. So that's very, very possible. So that's another reason why you would not want to communicate with any of your peers, because if, in your essay, if you're talking about a document and constantly referring to as document 3, and they know it's document 3 on a different form, you've kind of exposed yourself as not being completely on the up and up. Plus, they might have given you, it might be on the same topic. So like you might tell your friend like, oh, hey, I also have a question about democracy in the 19th century, but the phrasing of your question might be completely different. They might at the root be asking you two different things. So I think that's one of the protocols that they're using to try to keep security. So the AP Euro exam is today, and that's other than AP World, those and APUSH are like the three most similar exams for us. AP Gov is not the same. They don't do it necessarily, they don't do a DBQ this year. It's like kind of different, but the AP Euro exam and the AP World exams are both just straight up DBQs. So the AP Euro exam is today. So after I talk to some AP Euro teachers, if I hear anything new, I will also let you know that. One thing I did see is, first of all, make sure that you guys watch the tutorial thing that College Board sent out, that I sent to you, that College Board sent to your email, that Ms. Horton reminded you to watch. If you don't watch that, I already talked to a few teachers, and Trevor Packer last night on Twitter said that out of everyone that took AP exams yesterday, 2% of people experienced problems. And from the teachers that I talked to, they said that their own students that experienced problems, they know were students who were not prepared, students who didn't watch the tutorial like they were supposed to, didn't read the AP information. Some of the students were students who hadn't done really any online work this whole time. So, you need to make sure that you are as informed as you need to be to make sure that you do it right. One thing was, you have to put your identification number at the top of every page, I believe. And there were some students who forgot to do that. Trevor Packer did go on Twitter last night and say that that's okay, that they still can score your exam, but that it makes it easier for them to score it. So there could be a delay in getting your scores if you don't follow all the instructions. So please make sure that you watch those videos, read that packet that I sent you and that College Board sent you, so that you know all of the information. I'll go over the highlights like Thursday when we have our bigger review thing the day before the exam, but you need to make sure that you have gotten all the information necessary. They've sent it to you. It's not on me to read regurgitate all of that information. You need to read all of that, and you need to make sure that you know what you need to do. Everyone at this point should have already been in contact with Ms. Horton about making sure that your College Board has the right email address. So if you're not getting emails from College Board, you have whole other issues. So make sure that if you haven't received any of that stuff, that you talk to Ms. Horton and she can work it out. I think that was everything I was going to say. One quick thing. When you're working on your, I'm going to be grading your conservatism DBQs today. Whenever you are working on your next DBQ or, your final exam, obviously, make sure you have the rubric in front of you. Even if you, completely blank out and forget everything I ever taught you, the rubric literally tells you what to do. It says you need to describe 2 documents. You need to support your argument with 4 documents. You need to explain the point of view, audience, historical situation, or purpose of 1 or 2 documents. You need to provide 2 pieces of outside evidence. So you don't have to sit there and say like, oh, am I doing the right thing? Did I? And as you're doing it, mark it off on your rubric if you want, if you have a hard copy. Once you've described the content of 2 documents, you can do a third as a safety net, but don't feel like you need to do all 5 of them. That's too much writing and you're wasting time. Also, I did see a couple of people in their DBQs, I meant to mention this yesterday, quote documents. Do not do that. I've said that in class, but only once, I believe. So I'm going to say it again here. Do not quote the documents. College Board does not like that. You do not need to quote the documents. In reality, it is such a waste of your time to do that. The time that you spend typing out this quote is time that you can spend putting in your actual argument. They know what's in the document. They gave you the document. They want to know that you know what's in the document. Not that you can read it and type it back to them, but that you can summarize it. So if you use a couple of words, like if it's a document, if the question's about, antebellum labor systems and there's the speech in there calling slavery a peculiar institution, if you quote and say a peculiar institution, that's like a historical reference and that's good. But you don't need to give us like full sentences. That's absolute, like, don't do more than like 5 words. That's really the max of what you would ever want to quote. And even then, it would probably be best if you can just summarize, because when you summarize a document, that counts as your describe point, and you need to do that for 2 documents, 3 if you want to be safe. So anyway, I hope that makes sense. Like I said, keep your rubric in front of you. Okay, now I'm going to get into the periods for 4 and 5 review. If you didn't watch the stream yesterday, or if you did and you want to go back and rewatch it, it took a long time to process because it was a long video, but it is back up now. So you should be able to rewatch it if you want, watch it at double speed if you want. I do that a lot. And I'm sure the same will be true for this one. This one won't be quite as long, I hope, as the one yesterday, because I don't have as many things to say in the beginning. However, there's a lot of content in periods 4 and 5. Remember, period 4 was the period that you guys were like, this has literally lasted for eternity. Periods 4 and period 7 are like the longest. No. Yeah. No, so periods 4 and 7, they're freaking huge. So, hopefully it won't take me super long to go over these, but even if you go, like when this is over, if you go back up and look at it and it's not there right away, it will be there later. It just has to process. All right, so period 4, which is 1800 to 1848. So 1800 starts with the election of 1800, the revolution of 1800, as Jefferson calls it. So the Jefferson administration summarized the case of Marbury versus Madison and explained its significance. I touched on that yesterday when we talked about the midnight judges. Remember, William Marbury was angry that James Madison didn't deliver his court appointment because he was supposed to be one of those midnight judges. And he sued to get the judgeship. And what is important about this case is that it establishes judicial review. Honestly, that's really the only thing you need to know about this case. Know that it is coming out of the midnight judges, and know that it establishes judicial review. How did the Louisiana Purchase contradict Jefferson's beliefs about the presidency? Remember, Jefferson being a Democratic Republican, he was a strict constructionist. He only wanted to do what the Constitution said. The Constitution doesn't say that the president can purchase land to increase the size of the United States, but Jefferson did that anyway because he thought it was too good of an opportunity not to take. He was very torn over that, but ultimately he chose to buy the land, obviously. Blank and blank were hired by Jefferson to explore this territory. Lewis and Clark, what were their major goals? Okay, so they needed to make a map of the area. They were supposed to make friends with the Native Americans and have good relationships with them. They were supposed to find a water route to the Pacific Ocean, and they were supposed to record any plant or animal life that is basically like newly discovered. In 1807, the British Navy began the impressment of U.S. soldiers or sailors and merchants to avoid war, but punish both France, to punish both France and Great Britain for the constant violation of U.S. neutrality. Jefferson passed an embargo. Remember, oh, grab me, the turtle, which is a ban on exports. And that was unfortunately one of the things that people were really angry at Jefferson about. So he didn't run for a third term. And James Madison became president number 4. So the Madison administration dominated by the War of 1812. Causes of the War of 1812. I know it's been so long since we've gone over this, but remember, this was the war where they were impressing our sailors. And then while all of that was going on, we were fighting with Tecumseh and the Shawnees and the natives in the Northwest Territory after, the Northwest Rebellion, Northwest Indian Wars. Later on, we're fighting against them again. Battle of Tippecanoe, all of that stuff. So causes would be the War Hawks, people like Henry Clay, those Western congressmen who are really pressuring Madison to declare war on Britain. Cause will also be the impressment of American sailors, the incident with the Leopard and the Chesapeake. Remember, that was where we basically were like in battle with the British in their ship. Also, the Battle of Tippecanoe, the alliance between the British and the natives. There are plenty of causes. So we know we did end up fighting the British during the War of 1812, this time with no help from France or Spain, and we were victorious. So important effects of this, probably the biggest is there could be two, depending on how you look at it. One of the biggest is the rise in manufacturing that we're going to see. We know that we weren't purchasing manufactured goods from Great Britain during the war because we were fighting them. So we were basically forced to rely on our own ability to manufacture goods. And so after coming out of the War of 1812, we're going to hit that big industrial boom. And that's something we're going to see constantly growing in the North over the rest of time. But really, intensely over the next 50 years or so. Also, the loss of the Federalists. They were constantly associated with being pro-Britain, and they were very against the war. But since we won the war, it kind of made them look stupid, and people really wanted to distance themselves from anything that was like that. So the Federalists are going to die out, and they're going to be replaced by the Democratic Republicans will divide into the National Republicans and the Democrats, and the Democrats will remain, and then the National Republicans will essentially fizzle out and also merge into the Whigs. And then we know the Whigs will branch off, and part of the Whigs will form the Republican Party, and then we'll just have Republicans and Democrats for the next 100 years or so. So this loss of the Federalist Party is one of our first big changes in political parties. It also will lead to increase in national pride. We know this next period is one of big wave of nationalism. It also led to respect from European countries, more respect from France and Spain. It also led to what was I about to say? Oh, I was going to say an example of that nationalism is our national anthem, which came out of the War of 1812. Francis Scott Key trying to save Dr. Beans on the boat in Baltimore. I can't remember if I've given you 5 or not, but if I haven't given you 5, I'm sure you can think of one more. But so there are a lot of effects. I don't foresee them asking you anything that's during the War of 1812. I don't foresee them see you definitely needing to know like about particular battles or the burning of the White House or anything like that. But I could see the question being, perhaps about, work exchange and technology in the 19th century, which would definitely start with the effects of the War of 1812. All right, so Monroe. 2 reasons that this era is known as the era of good feelings. That is because of nationalism, which we just mentioned, and a booming economy, which stems from that. We know we're going to hit the like King Cotton phase during all this, but we're also going to hit our Industrial Revolution. So that's another reason. Define nationalism: extreme pride and attachment to one's country. You're placing the value of your nation as a whole over your region or your section. Provide an example of nationalism in each branch of government. Executive would be the president. What are some things that Monroe does to promote nationalism? Monroe Doctrine, pretty obvious there. Legislative branch, that would be Henry Clay and the American system. Remember, that was like the 3-part system to try and unify the United States by like selling Western lands and building new infrastructure and things like that. And then the judicial branch definitely would be John Marshall and his cases like Gibbons v. Ogden or McCulloch v. Maryland, cases where he constantly is favoring the federal government over the state government. Summarize the main point of Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. The College Board loves this, so I could totally see this being a document, depending on what the question is. But Democracy in America, you read a piece of it, but you read the piece about how he was talking about women's education and how women in America have a lot more opportunities than they do in Europe. But the overall point was really like, what's the culture of America? And something that he says is that nothing's ever good enough for us. We're constantly trying to move forward. We always want like progress. We always want things to be bigger and better and faster and more efficient. And that's very true and something that we'll see happening all the time. Provide an example of nationalism in these areas of American culture, literature. We've got our first major American authors on the world market, people like Washington Irving. Language, we've got our own American dictionary. Art, Hudson River School, you remember those landscape paintings. And then music, national anthem, obviously being a wonderful example. Foreign relations, Rush-Bagot Treaty, that was the agreement with Great Britain settling the western border and northern border with Canada as the 49th parallel, almost a 39th. That is the Koreas. Wrong parallel, the 49th parallel. Adams-Onis Treaty, agreement with Spain, giving U.S. Florida. That's when we got Florida. Wish we could get a return on that. Oregon Treaty, agreement with also Great Britain, allowing Americans to settle in Oregon for 10 years. And then we know later we'll amend that treaty to basically like take Oregon. After the whole like 54-40 or fight drama. Define sectionalism. So kind of just like nationalism, but your section, your region, prioritizing your region over your nation. So that's something that while we see this is a big period of nationalism, this is also a big period of sectionalism, because while we're proud of our country as a whole and like America in general is doing some really impressive things, the North and the South are becoming so different from each other that a lot of the mindset in the people in those regions is like, I can only relate to Southerners, like Northerners. They don't know what life is like down here. And I'm sure you've heard, people say that before living in the South. I'm sure people in the North have said it a billion times. And so we're seeing sectionalism simultaneously increasing as we see nationalism increasing, which is kind of weird. It just depends on where you live and who you are. Compare and contrast the North and the South during the antebellum period. Well, we know that the North has a very diverse population because of immigrants. The South does not. It's pretty much just white people and a slave population. The North is industrialized. The South completely relies on agriculture, where there's a lot of invention and technology in the North. The South is only relying on one invention, and that is the cotton gin. The North has a lot of new modes of transportation. The South does not. Like railroads, for example, the South's railroad, the amount of railroad track they're going to have is pales in comparison. The North obviously relies on a wage labor class who gets paid but very little and works in rough conditions. The South relies on a slave labor group, which obviously gets paid none, working in worse conditions. So there are a lot of people that say that the conditions in which they worked were similar. That's kind of not real, but we know that it wasn't glamorous to be like a Lowell girl or something, but hands down, would choose that 10 times out of 10 over being a slave. So there are, the similarities are, tiny in the overall, how the North and South were growing more and more different all of the time. All right, so that brings us to our first Henry Clay compromise. Thank you, Henry Clay, R.I.P., our main man. 1820. No. Yes. 1820. Author Henry Clay purposed to admit Missouri as a state and to figure out how to keep the balance of power between slave states and free states. Because before this, I believe we were at like 11-11, and admitting Missouri as a slave state would tip the balance, and the North didn't want that. So we needed a choice. So they not only add Missouri as a slave state, they add Maine as a free state, and they draw that Missouri Compromise line, saying that all the land above the line would be closed to slavery, all the land below the line would be open to slavery. But there was way more land above the line than below the line. So if the South wants to expand, they will need to grow the land, and that will involve going to war with Mexico. Three inventors and their inventions from the Industrial Revolution: telephone, telegraph, air brake, refrigerator, train car. There are a million. Any the steam power or the steamboat, the cotton gin you could even consider. So there are a million you can write down. I don't need to tell you. Jacksonian democracy. So this is this, and there are a lot of APUSH teachers online really saying that they believe that the DBQ might have something to do with Jackson or democracy in the 19th century, which would really have to do with Jackson. So we'll see. That could be it could be the question. It could be a question. We don't know how any of that's going to play out, but I definitely think that it's a strong possibility. But remember that right before Jackson was elected, they lifted a bunch of voter restrictions, allowing poor people, landless men, to vote for the first time. And they really identified with Jackson. He catered to their vote. He was that guy. He was a self-made man. He had been so poor. He worked his way up to president. People really identified with that. He was just like a guy you'd want to, like get a drink with or something. And people love that. And it's what's going to keep him in office. He did not, campaign or play to the upper class because he didn't need their votes. There are way more people at the bottom than there are people at the top, and he inspired them to show up on election day and to vote for him. So the Jacksonian democracy is that like new voting base and the emergence of these new voters that are going to affect elections for years and years to come. 5 civilized tribes: Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole. What piece of legislation ordered the forced removal of the Native Americans? That would be the Indian Removal Act of 1830. What was decided in Worcester v. Georgia? That was when Marshall said that the states, Georgia cannot pass laws that only apply on Native American reservations because they're sovereign and they are only under the umbrella of the federal government, and that Georgia needed to back off and leave the Cherokee alone. And its impact was that it really put a strain on the relationship between the judicial and the executive branch, because remember, Jackson's trying to get Georgia to force these natives out, and John Marshall's basically telling them they can't. Jackson pretty much gives him like a huge middle finger after that, and has the natives removed anyway. And that was when we saw the Trail of Tears. Bank war. Why does Jackson hate the bank? A lot of it had to do with his upbringing. He felt it was corrupt. He didn't trust paper money. He thought it rigged elections. A lot of that probably went back to the election that he lost to John Quincy Adams, and him thinking the whole thing was corrupt anyway. He thought it favored northern industries. He's a southern guy. He had a lot of reasons. 2 actions he takes to kill the bank. 1, he vetoes it, right? That's a straight up clear action to kill the bank. And then 2, instead of just waiting for the bank to expire, he pulls all the money out of the bank and puts them in his pet banks, those state banks. And in doing so, essentially renders the national bank useless and functionless before its charter was actually over. Nullification Crisis, the opposing views of the tariff of 1828. So pro would be the North. They were happy with the tariff because it was encouraging Americans to buy American manufactured goods instead of British goods, which were cheaper. And why were British goods cheaper? Some people have asked me before, and that's because they just have more manufacturing capabilities, supply and demand. When supply is low, prices increase. And the supply, while we are constantly increasing our manufacturing capabilities, we still are not quite up to par with Great Britain yet. So it was still cheaper to buy your products from Great Britain, depending on the product. Of course, against the tariff is the South, who is basically being forced to buy expensive American goods or pay this really, really high tax and then buy these British goods. So it's basically like a huge, payday for America one way or the other. What caused the South to nullify and what was Jackson's response? What makes South Carolina finally nullify is they raised the tariff again in 1832. And that's when South Carolina passed their nullification bill. Jackson's response was to pass the force bill, saying he would force them to pay the tax. And they had said in their nullification bill that if he forced them, then they would fight him. They would secede and they would rebel. And so we came very close to a civil war here. But then finally, Henry Clay solves this crisis, puts off civil war for a little while longer by creating the Compromise Tariff of 1833. And what party was created out of opposition to Jackson after this? And that would be the Whigs. The Whigs emerge shortly after this, led by Henry Clay. Out of nullifiers, people who were against Jackson, and all those guys. All right, immigration that pushes, things that push you out of your country, like famine, pulls, things that pull you to America, like economic opportunity or religious freedom. Most immigrants from this time were from were from Ireland and Germany. Those are the countries that go there. Almost got our new immigrants confused, which is Eastern and Southern Europe. But we are here talking just about the Irish and the Germans for the most part. And this led to an increase in nativism, which is the belief that native-born white Americans are superior to immigrants, even if those immigrants are white. Second Great Awakening. How did the Second Great Awakening spark a new reform era? Remember, the Second Great Awakening was about like doing good works and like taking on more of a like ownership in your religion and like doing good things to like spread God's love and show positivity. And a lot of women were part of these like small church groups who were that were started by the Second Great Awakening, and then they started participating in these social reforms. Those like women's groups did, and they became reform societies. So temperance movement. The temperance movement is long. There are a lot of key figures. Frances Willard is probably one of the more famous women associated with the temperance movement much later in its time period. Noteworthy facts is that they weren't necessarily against the ban of alcohol, but moderation. And then slowly that will transfer into the prohibition movement to actually ban it. But Maine became the first state to ban alcohol. It was pretty early in the 1900s when they did it too. I just can't remember the year. Prison reform. Dorothea Dix, of course, for those of you who took civil liberties last semester or this semester, you know her by Dragon Dix. We love Dorothea. So remember, she was originally an education reformer. She was reading to prisoners, and in doing so, she saw the terrible conditions that a lot of them were being forced to live in, and the lack of help for people who really needed like mental illness help, or people who were handicapped and being kept in the same facilities with like no real medical treatment. So noteworthy facts, like I said, all the ways that she got involved, and then she campaigned in her state of Massachusetts to get Massachusetts to open up mental health treatment facilities. And there are now hundreds, if not thousands, in the United States today that bear her name and that were started because of her work. Education reform. Oh, sorry. I don't know who is calling me, but I cannot answer right now. I'm quite busy. Education reform. This is John Dewey and his push for normal schools and common schools. Remember, common schools are like public schools. Normal schools are the temperance key figure, Francis Willard. But he normal schools for teachers, and then also mandatory attendance, things like that. Also, those McGuffey readers, those like first textbooks for kids, those became super popular. Women's rights is the beginning of the women's movement, right? Seneca Falls, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucretia Mott writing the Declaration of Sentiments, not sediments, which is rocks, but sentiments. And we'll see the beginning of the women's suffrage movement here. Abolition, the largest movement out of all of these Second Great Awakening movements, because a lot of people saw certainly abolishing slavery as a moral thing and a Christian thing. Ironic, considering how many slave owners consider themselves to be Christians, but I digress. Major abolitionists, I would say the ones that you should know would be of course, Frederick Douglass, but also William Lloyd Garrison. Those are probably the two most famous, maybe even the Grimke sisters, but probably the two that I would see them potentially having a document from might be those two guys. So noteworthy facts: Underground Railroad, North Star, Liberator, major abolitionist newspapers, and we know that okay, sorry. I'm getting a lot of text messages. Anyway, so that's it for abolitionism. Transcendentalism, Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson. Transcendentalism, remember, is the idea that like true knowledge is not just from like observation, but from like your personal like experiences as well. It's not from just like being told something, it's from like going out and like living. It's very much like spiritual and being connected to the world. So why can't they both have three names and I always want to like rearrange the way that their names are. William, what did I just say? Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson. God, that was hard. I don't blame y'all if y'all can't remember those, but remember one of them, Thoreau, he wrote Civil Disobedience, which was like, if there's a law that you think is like morally wrong, then it's your like duty to break it in a civil way. So that's something that's going to influence the civil rights movement down the line. Sit-ins are a perfect example. But for Thoreau, remember, he didn't pay his taxes because he didn't want to financially support a government that was making money off the taxes of slavery, and making money off of slave labor. And so, he went to jail. You can't just not pay your taxes. Of course, it was for a good reason, but still, you can't just not pay your taxes. Yeah, taxation is theft, though. I can hear Caleb saying it now. Utopianism, Robert Owen. Remember, these are the guys who want to create this like perfect society. Pretty much every time it doesn't really work out because people are imperfect. So how could they create a perfect society? It's not really possible. But the closest thing that we saw was the Shakers, which by now there aren't really a lot of Shakers around. There are plenty of Quakers, but Shakers are a sect of Quakers who kind of established and kind of like Amish people, I guess is sort of the best way to think of them. All right, manifest destiny. This idea that God has given America the right to own and control and settle, not just the right, but the responsibility to control and settle all of North America. So that's going to involve getting some extra land and then getting out there. So how are we going to get out there? These migration trails. Santa Fe Trail, first major migration trail, is 800 miles long. Oregon Trail, 2,000 miles long, the most dangerous, certainly the most famous. That was where the Donner Party died, RIP. Gold Rush, 80,000 people start heading from California in what year? Come on, it's like, other than the Jamestown in 1607 and maybe the Declaration of Independence in 1776, knowing that the California was in 1848 is probably at the top of the list of things that you should know. I mean, 1848 is when they discover the gold, and then 49 is when the rush happens, right? They're the 49ers. Traveled along the California Trail, Oregon Treaty, Polk's campaign slogan, 54-40 or fight. Remember, he wanted our line to be at the 54th parallel, but after he gets elected, he settles for 49. Signs a treaty making the U.S. border at the 49th parallel. Texas independence. Spain originally held claim to Mexico. Used the mission system to settle Texas. It did not work, so they began hiring impresarios, which were like contractors and recruiters, people who brought mostly Americans to Texas to settle the land and to begin to build on it. Mexican dictator Santa Anna, not to invoke his ghost again now that we're finally free of him, but unfortunately he has to come up right now. He cracked down on the Texans. Remember the Alamo. Remember that was one of those rallying cries to invoke and to try to remind everyone how much of a dictator and an evil tyrant Santa Anna was. Ultimately, Texas was successful. They got their independence, or they did in their mind, not so much in Mexico's mind. And then the U.S. annexed Texas, which led to tensions between us and Mexico, because like I said, they still saw that land as theirs. So we begin the Mexican-American War after a border dispute about where really is the border with Texas. And sorry, these text messages. I need to just stop looking at my watch. Every time I look at these messages, I just lose my train of thought. But we saw the border as the Rio Grande, and Mexico saw the border as the Nueces, I think is how you say it. But nevertheless, we sort of orchestrated this whole, fight to small skirmish, like go down in the disputed territory, and then use that as an excuse to go to war with Mexico. When the war ended, we signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo to get ourselves the Mexican cession, which is basically all the land that we got from Mexico at the end of the war, other than the really tiny piece at the bottom of California and Arizona. And that is known as the Gadsden Purchase. We didn't pay for that. We didn't really pay for anything in the Mexican cession. We just sort of like took it as a war trophy. All right, so that's period 4, very lengthy. Now we'll get into period 5, which shouldn't take quite as long. It's not as lengthy because we spent a lot of time going over battles and stuff, and you don't quite need to know as many battles as we talked about in class for the AP exam. Wilmot Proviso, that was where David Wilmot proposed that we ban slavery in all of the land that we got from Mexico. And this was like one of the first, big moments of drama in these like 1850s, like pre-war decade here. And of course, the South refuses, threatens to secede if it's even voted on. It did fail, but it still made the South like very paranoid that someone's trying to like come after slavery. And we know things will only get worse in terms of that mindset over the next 10 years. The Compromise of 1850, written by Henry Clay, our last Clay Compromise, and passed in Congress by what's his face? The little dude, the little giant, Stephen Douglas. And Douglas with 1 S. Frederick Douglass is Douglas with 2 S's. And because remember, when Henry Clay wrote it, he wrote it as one big bill and it didn't pass. So Stephen Douglas rewrote it as 8 separate bills and passed each bill separately. For the North, what do they get? They get to ban slavery in D.C. and they also get to add California as a free state. What does the South get? They get the Congress cannot interfere in the interstate slave trade now, and they also get a new fugitive slave law. For either, we're going to make Utah and New Mexico. Yes. Yes. Popular sovereignty. Questioning those states. Utah, I'm confident on. New Mexico, for some reason, I'm questioning. But nevertheless, I'm doing, by the way, if you haven't noticed, I'm doing all of this off the top of my head. So if I tell you something wrong, take it easy on me. What book brought the hatred of slavery to new heights in the 1850s? That would be 1852. Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Kansas-Nebraska Act, written by Stephen Douglas in 1854. Why was it written? Several reasons, one of which being he wanted to make himself a big deal, but the main reason being we needed to settle that land out there because we needed to build railroads, and we couldn't do that unless we had real plans for that land and had divided it up into territories and everything. So what this basically does, the effect is it throws out the Missouri Compromise. And instead of saying really all this land should have just been closed to slavery because it was above the Missouri Compromise line, Stephen Douglas instead opens it to popular sovereignty, which we know will lead us straight to bleeding Kansas. What three groups together create the new Republican Party? The best word you're ever going to hear me say, free soulers. The Northern Democrats, and the Conscience Whigs. Those would be the three groups that come together to form the new Republican Party. Dred Scott's case, the Supreme Court ruled that African Americans could not, you could say, sue in court here, and that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional because it violated the Fifth Amendment and your right to protect your property, eminent domain. The government can't take your property without proper compensation. And the Supreme Court said if we abolish slavery, then we're taking your property without proper compensation. So it basically said African Americans and slaves are not people. And then on top of that, you can't really abolish slavery anywhere. So that led to, tons of issues. The purpose and the effect of John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Our man, John Brown, who I will, speaking into existence one day, talk about in a drunk history whenever Derek Waters finds out who I am and calls me. But remember, his purpose was to start a slave rebellion in the South and to free all the slaves. The effect? Not successful, but he does become this martyr figure for the North, this man who is willing to die and do anything he needed to do to help save these people. Obviously not successful, but he'll be used as this villain character for the South and this hero character for the North for years to come. The Freeport Doctrine, that came from the Lincoln-Douglas debates in Freeport, Illinois. That was when Stephen Douglas, basically before people had thought that Stephen Douglas was basically pro-slavery because he had been allowing slavery to expand, but he comes out in the Freeport Doctrine as saying no, I'm not free slavery. I'm just free. I'm not pro-slavery. I'm just pro whatever the people want to do. If they want to have slavery, they have slavery. If they don't want to have slavery, they abolish slavery. I don't really care. And so now everyone's annoyed at him because they're take a stance on slavery. You can't be a middle of the road guy anymore. You need to either be pro or you need to be con. And so if you try to be middle of the road, the pro and the con people are all going to be mad at you. Ultimately, he did win the Illinois election during those debates, but that will really bite him in the butt when he tries to run for president in 1860. Civil War. 1860, depending on what you consider the beginning of the war. If you consider South Carolina secession to be the beginning, 1860. If you consider Fort Sumter to be the beginning, 1861. But no matter what you think the beginning is, the end, we know, is Lee surrendering to Grant in 1865. Union strategy, Anaconda Plan, blockade the Atlantic, take control of the Mississippi, squeeze, cut them off from supplies, and then invade, which worked flawlessly. Explain the Confederate strategy, which I'm not going to look at my watch. I know better now. Explain the Confederate strategy, which was cotton diplomacy, basically forced Great Britain and France to get involved on the South's behalf by basically extorting them. And big shocker, that backfired and will hurt the cotton industry for years to come in the South. Major battles. These are the only ones that this study guide's really thorough because it's for the full exam, which you're not taking. But these, if you're being asked a question about the Civil War or something, these are really the only major battles that are worth mentioning. Fort Sumter, because it's the beginning of the war, and it starts the whole thing. Bull Run, because it's the first major battle to make everyone realize, like, oh, this isn't going to be some small little rebellion. Like, this is going to be a whole war after this. Lincoln realizes he needs a lot more troops than he had. And it also shows the North, like, the South isn't just like putting on a little rebellion here. Like, they came to play. Antietam, single bloodiest day in American history, and Lee's first attempt at a win in the Union, which he doesn't get. Chancellorsville, Lee's greatest victory. That was where he like lit the fires and did the surprise attack with Stonewall Jackson, who did die at Chancellorsville. So that was that really crazy, complicated one. Gettysburg, which was Lee's last attempt at a win in the Union. Gettysburg's in Pennsylvania, and it was a major turning point in the war. And on the same day that Lee retreated at Gettysburg, Grant won at Vicksburg, which was the last stronghold on the Mississippi. So now we really see through both of these wins that the Anaconda Plan is working. Years: Fort Sumter was in 1861, Bull Run and Antietam were in 1862, Chancellorsville and Gettysburg and Vicksburg were all in 1863. Explain how women were affected by the war. We know there were plenty of women who volunteered for the war effort. We know that, but for the most part, it was women at home. So like in the North, they were getting manufacturing jobs. In the South, they were running farms. And, you know, everything in between. Lots of nurses. Remember our Red Cross lady, what's her name? Claire Barton. Civil War nurse. Explain how African Americans were affected by the war. That's a loaded question. And there are books and books and books written on that, and I gave you 4 lines. But essentially what I mean is, how are African Americans involved in the war? We know in the North they fought in combat and in non-combat jobs, the 54th Massachusetts being a great example, and like their involvement at the Battle of Fort Wagner. I could see there have been some sample DBQs before about like African Americans' involvement in the Civil War, and under this new, since they rewrote the DBQ like in 2016, they haven't asked a question about the Civil War, so it's possible. I wouldn't hold my breath because it seems too easy, and I don't think they're going to take it easy on anyone, but anything's possible. But I could definitely see, you know, on the sample DBQ that's been released, that's about, you know, not recently, it was a few years ago, the sample DBQ that was about African Americans in the Civil War, there was a photograph of the 54th was one of the documents. And then in the South, we know the slaves were used for non-combat jobs. But then, of course, how are they affected by the war in general? The ending of the war will lead to the abolishment of slavery. What was Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction? 10% plan. Trying to go, you know, move forward with love and light. That's what I always say. That's what Lincoln wanted to do. Unfortunately, he died. And no one else really wanted to move forward with love and light. 13th Amendment that abolished slavery. 14th Amendment established equal protection and citizenship. And the 15th Amendment granted all male suffrage. Civil Rights Act of 1866. This was trying to overturn, and ultimately did overturn, a lot of those black codes that the South was passing. Not all of them, but a lot of them. The Military Reconstruction Act, that was where we basically did, you know, it's like the Hunger Games of the South. We like divide the South up into 5 occupied zones and give military generals zones. Like Sherman got a zone, and that just, you know, made the South angrier. But the purpose was to monitor them, you know, like putting them in timeout and making sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, which we know once the occupation is over, they're not going to do what they're supposed to do. Tenure of Office Act. This is what told Johnson he couldn't fire executive branch employee without congressional approval. He violated this, which led to his impeachment. And the Enforcement Acts, which were those laws that Grant signed, which were known as the KKK Acts, to basically be able to arrest Klansmen, and it also made interfering with someone's right to vote a federal crime. What did the Freedmen's Bureau do? They did a lot of things. They set up schools. They basically were trying to help slaves and you know, poor people make the transition from pre-war to post-war, whether that meant reuniting your family, helping you find a job, helping you learn how to read, all of those things. Sharecropping is kind of like slavery, right? Sharecropping is where in exchange for a share of the profit on my crop sale, you will live in the house that I provide for you, eat the food that I provide for you, and grow this crop and work my land. And then but it was really easy for landowners to then go back and like charge extra, and so the share you got was less than what you owe me, so then I'm like keeping you in this like state of perpetual slavery. Much of Grant's presidency was marked by corruption and scandal. I know that's something that you should definitely remember. Whiskey Ring was where they embezzled like millions of dollars through the Treasury Department, through like fake revenue stamps somehow. I've read a million times how that worked, and I don't know enough about money and law like that to fully understand, but they got a lot of money out of it, but they got caught and went to jail. Salary Grab Act, that was when Congress tried to raise their own pay and kind of bribe Grant into signing it by raising his pay in the same bill. And the Tweed Ring, which was Boss Tweed, who embezzled all that money from the state of New York. The slaughterhouse cases were the Supreme Court cases like U.S. v. Cruikshank, which really limited a lot of those Reconstruction amendments and other Reconstruction laws that Congress had been passing to try and support African Americans. Remember, U.S. v. Cruikshank was the Colfax massacre case, and which basically said that those Reconstruction amendments protect you from the government violating your rights, not from people violating your rights. So because it wasn't a official military unit that lynched and murdered all of those African American soldiers, really nobody got like charged with anything. The Compromise of 1807, the end of Reconstruction, Rutherford B. Hayes would become president. Troops would be removed from the South. A Southerner would be appointed to a powerful cabinet position, and the South would also receive federal money for physical reconstruction, infrastructure, rebuilding of railroads, and things like that. And once that compromise is signed, we consider that to be the end of Reconstruction. And the Gilded Age kind of begins when Grant is president, but it's also easy to consider that once Reconstruction is over, now we're in the full swing of the Gilded Age. So I hope that was a helpful review. I hope you've got all of your, I hope that jogged your memory for all of the things that we haven't thought about since periods 4 and 5 were finished. Continue to work on your study guide. I'll go again live tomorrow, and I'll do period 6 and 7, which are also long ones. So it'll probably take about the same amount of time that today took. Work on your, or at least, work on your crash course videos. Once I get your feedback up for your conservatism DBQ, then you can work on your role of women in America DBQ, which is the last one. That one's a cross periods DBQ. I want you to do something like that because I think it's very possible that's what they'll give you on Friday. If you need help with anything, of course, let me know. Several of you reached out to me after you read your feedback from your other DBQ, and I'm happy to do that with the rest of you. If you need to call me to talk about it, or if you just need some clarification via text, totally fine. Just let me know. Where can I find the rubric for the new grading system? I uploaded it. I did upload it in a previous module, but I can upload a new copy. I can upload a fresh copy under this current review module. I'll do that right when this is done so that you have a new version of it to look at. But if you Google APUSH 2020 rubric, the College Board rubric is the same as the rubric I'm going to show you. It's just written a little bit differently, so it's kind of more confusing. The rubric I'm going to show you was basically taken from the college rubric and rewritten to be student friendly by an AP teacher, Tom Ritchie. So I'll upload that now so that you can look at that while you're working on your other stuff. Don't forget your crash course stuff is due by Friday, and your role of women in America DBQ is due by 5 o'clock tomorrow. So I'll get you your feedback as quickly as I can today. Adios.